Maybe I took too many drugs, it could be.
So what are your plans now?
Well, rest, I'm sure this pass again and rest, and then aim for the same goal again. If that means if Reinhold isn't too far ahead, you know, because he went to South Col today, and he went early, so they should reach it. They went all without oxygen, all the Sherpas. The Sherpas didn't like it at all.
They didn't?
No, they didn't, because they may think if they have to go up to Camp 5. And if something goes wrong, you know, they die. That's what they thought.
Something did go wrong. The blizzard struck, trapping Messner and the two Sherpas on the South Col. Conditions were bad enough at the relatively sheltered Camp 2. On the Col, 80-mile-an-hour winds ripped their tent, and conditions became so bad that the Sherpas lay down in their tent and lost hope.
Hello! Hello!
Peter Habeler had descended alone, getting sicker and weaker. In a moment's lack of concentration, he had missed the route in thick cloud, and only the chance find of a marker pole prevented him from spending his last hours lost in the western cool. High on the South Col, Reinhold was fighting his own battle, abusing and threatening the two Sherpas to keep them awake as the temperatures dropped to -45 and the lightning flickered around their tent. After 2 nights, they descended to Camp 3, then tottered into Camp 2, looking like 3 old men. They had been lucky to survive, and Peter Habeler began to have serious doubts about a second attempt. Messner was unaffected.
What are the conditions of the finals of 3,000 feet, Reinhold?
For the South Col, to the last camp is an easy way. All snow and you can go so. It's a way I can do, also I'm quite crazy to do it.
Yeah.
But the last steep, the last step is very steep.
Given good conditions, do you think you can do it?
Yes, but I have to see for a new partner. Maybe Peter is coming up again, but I know Peter is the strongest climber I know.
Yeah.
But in this year, you see, he's almost changing. He's going 100 meters, a cloud is coming. He said, so there isn't nothing.
Yes.
Let's go back.
Yeah.
And so I did not the whole load phase. Robert did 300 meters. Peter did 100 meters, and the rest I did.
Yeah.
It is too much, I cannot do all.
So they descended out of the death zone to base camp, where the doctors were carrying out blood tests to measure the degree of acclimatization. One theory to help circulation was to drain off a pint of blood and inject a pint of plasma, effectively diluting the blood. Happily for high-altitude climbers, this experiment failed. The unlucky patient was very ill for 2 weeks. He was, of course, one of the doctors. During a prolonged stay at high altitude, the shortage of oxygen stimulates the bone marrow to produce more red blood corpuscles. After about a month at base camp, the number could have increased by 25%. Although this allows more oxygen to be carried to the body tissues, it makes the blood thicker. If it's not possible to drink 10 to 15 pints of fluid every day, the blood gets even stickier. This can cause poor circulation in the extremities and even clotting of the blood, particularly dangerous in the brain. Even a short exposure to the 80-mile-an-hour winds at a temperature of -40 degrees will cause frostbite in the fingers and toes, and eventually gangrene as the cells freeze and die. These risks are well known. Just when the situation gets out of control is unpredictable, sudden and irreversible. While Messner and Habeler recuperated, the main Austrian team made their attempt. 6 days after Reinhold Messner had staggered exhausted into base camp, 3 members of the expedition with their chief Sherpa reached the summit. They had all used oxygen. The thin air was an insidious enemy. The next victim was a Sherpa who had a stroke, totally paralyzing him down one side. Once again, his only chance of survival was to get down to a lower altitude than the expedition doctors at base camp.
This was a very serious case. He suffered a stroke in an altitude of 6,400 meters, in other words, about 21,000 feet. That is a very rare occurrence and is one of the most severe expressions of acute mountain sickness. We know from the literature that it occurred in the Himalayas several times, and people usually recovered from this rather quickly. Now, the unusual thing in this case was that he stayed paralyzed, hemi-paralyzed. I don't know the reason for this. He had either a thrombosis, which is possible as a consequence of increased viscosity of the blood, as a consequence of loss of fluid. It's also possible that he had a bleeding in his brain. We see very often in climbers coming back from high altitude, when we examine their eyes with an ophthalmoscope, we see bleedings, hemorrhages in the eye ground, and we know, or we have to assume, that the same bleedings also occur in the brain. And it's possible that this patient had bleedings on the right side of his brain. He was paralyzed on the left side. In any case, he didn't recover in the high altitude, and we had to lower him down, and, well, it was a rather tough rescue through the standby fall. It was very heavy work. It was a little dangerous. Looked sometimes a little rough, and I think what had happened in his brain had happened already 24 hours. His conditions didn't improve very markedly. His mental status improved a little bit, but not the signs of paralysis of the left side of his body. So we had to rescue him finally by helicopter from base camp to Kathmandu.